Christian parenting. I'm Julie Lyles-Carr. You're listening to the All Mom Does podcast, part of the Christian Parenting Podcast Network. Today on the All Mom Does podcast, I have a voice that I think is going to prove familiar to you in a few of its iterations. Mike Nawrocki is with me. Mike, I am so glad to get to meet you.
Julie, thank you so much. It's so glad to be on with you. And that voice that you mentioned, we can, access that if you'd like.
Oh, yes. I'm gonna call on that here before too long.
All right.
But you have done so much in your career. And we discovered we have a commonality that I don't get to encounter very often. Both of our dads were in the aerospace industry. My dad was in one of the private contractor side with the Space Shuttle program. Your dad on the Air Force side. We both grew up outside of Los Angeles. That is crazy. How was it for you growing up in that kind of environment?
Well, when you're a kid, it's all so it felt like normal. But then looking back, you were like, okay, well, not everybody that I knew had to move every 3 or 4 years and, got to live all over the world and learned how to kind of make friends fast, all that kind of stuff. So there's a lifestyle to it. I remember reading a book called Military Brats a number of years ago and just resonating with, oh my goodness, this is me. This is kind of my life. But it was great. I was real proud of my dad and continued to be. And he was in the Air Force for 22 years and then went into private contractor in the aerospace as well. So it was a great childhood.
Wow. How did you come out of it with that sense that it was a great childhood? Because, Mike, you and I both know people that had military kid upbringings and it wasn't so great for them. So what do you think made the difference for you? And for those parents out there listening who are in the military themselves, one of my daughters is seriously dating a guy who's in the military. And I'm trying to gear up on the things that can be helpful when it comes to kids and that experience of moving a lot and the uncertainty and all the things.
Well, our family was really close. And I remember growing up always with the sense of how much my parents loved me, and love covers a multitude of issues whenever there's exterior pressures. But I have 3 brothers. We got to be really close during that time. And in fact, a lot of times we were each other's only friends as we were moving into a new place because, we had to figure out, okay, we don't know anybody here, so we can hang out. So that was great. And then you just kind of learn to adapt. You wouldn't know it from my work as an animated vegetable, but I'm a little bit more of an introvert, just sort of naturally. So when I put on my Larry voice, I become very extroverted, but I'm a little bit more of an introvert. And I think that was because, that was due to kind of the fact that I didn't, always have a group and I'd had to kind of assimilate in wherever I went. And, you could handle that one or two ways. You could go in and be, kind of the boisterous one and, just, be the extroverted one who makes friends. But, I just sort of blended into the background and it took me a while to do that. I learned to adapt. That's a great attribute of kids who do that. Lived in Japan for a number of years, experienced different cultures. So there's a lot of good things that come from the change in your life with something like that. But there are challenges as well.
Right. I think it's important for me to note that I do think, as much as I hated moving, I was not gracious about it, Mike, at all. But I will say, I do think it gave my brothers and I a very close relationship because, as you said, these are the only people you're taking with you every time. These are the people that are your built-in friends. And I find it's true for me too. People don't believe it, but I am more of an introvert. And I think part of it was going into new situations and trying to decide which Julie I was going to put on in this new place I was moving to, because everywhere we moved had different requirements, even though I stayed within the domestic U.S., every place we lived was different. I mean, the clothes were different, different cultural norms were different, everything was different. So I think that's really interesting. Now, you did something that I kind of did too. We had these dads who were in these more technical fields and these fields that people would look at and see all this engineering and all of this math and all of this astrophysics. And then you kind of took a different turn and you went into entertainment and filmmaking. So talk to me about that transition. And you've already given a clue as to where part of that path led, but I want to hear about that transition from this household that was more scientific, shall we say, technical in nature, and then how you ended up in the entertainment industry.
I started it off kind of going in that path of kind of being in more of the scientific world. Part of it was due to my faith and then the influence of my family. So I headed to college with the idea of being a missionary doctor. My mom was a nurse. My dad was an engineer. My older brother, a chemistry major who, is now working in aerospace. So I looked around at the influences of my life, and I really felt a call to ministry of some sort. And I knew I didn't want to be a pastor, or, I didn't like public speaking at all. So it's like, okay, maybe that's out. But I felt like, serving people and helping people in this capacity would be wonderful. So, I went off in that direction, but God kind of changed my path along the way. At the first college I went to, I ran into Phil Vischer, who would later become known as Bob the Tomato. And I loved entertaining people growing up. I mean, that was one of the things, and probably one of my coping mechanisms, is just making people laugh. And so I ended up getting into theater and puppetry. I loved writing music. I loved parody music. I was a big Weird Al Yankovic fan. But those things, those things for me were more hobbies and just fun. But, I thought, I need to get a real job for God. And so I headed off in that direction. But in the course of all that, just had this great friendship with Phil. We came up with the concept of VeggieTales. Computer animation was just sort of emerging. We were both kind of computer guys and puppet guys at the same time. So we figured out a way to combine those and then came up with the show. So I ended up going through all of pre-med, studying for my MCATs. I was accepted into the Peace Corps to go teach biology for a couple of years. And I was going to come back and go to med school. But then at that very moment, we also found out that we, got funding for our first show. So went in that direction. So I think God had gifted me in ways that I did not know I could use, but provided that opportunity and that path to go on. So I teach at the college level now too. And I tell students, look, make your plans, set your goals, but always be willing and open to how God can use you in ways that you never imagined.
You never saw.
Yeah.
So how did this happen? And I'm sorry, let's stop for just a minute, Mike. We're going to have proof of life that you really are Larry. So give us something. I mean, just let us hear Larry boy, Larry the cucumber. Tell us something we need to know just so we can prove you are who you say you are.
Julie, did you know that God made you special and he loves you very much?
I did know that, and I don't know where my hairbrush is. So, I just want to establish here, I'm a long time.
Okay, neither do I.
Yeah,
okay, good. There is a raging debate about VeggieTales, very controversial, and maybe you can settle that for us today. Mm-hmm. You are aware that cucumbers like Larry and tomatoes like Bob are actually fruit. So how do you reconcile this theological debacle?
Yeah, and as a biology major, I should have known that going in.
So how did you guys come up with this concept? Because nothing like this was really around at the time. And I can remember when VeggieTales first started coming out and my older kids were younger at that age. And it was almost a relief to me to find something that I felt like was witty and funny and cutting edge and different, that also had a great message that wasn't, and this is going to sound very critical, but at this point with 8 kids, as many years as I've been around and as much content as we've consumed as a family.
Yeah.
VeggieTales was this revelation. I mean, how did this all come about? Because who's like sitting around drinking coffee going, what would be a great kids show?
A couple of college kids, that too. Yeah. So I mentioned Phil and I met in college doing puppets. And I mean, we both had very similar kind of comic influences and in terms of the Muppets and Monty Python and Mel Brooks. I mean, that's kind of where our sense of humor lied. And we just loved performing, but in the context of actually wrapping a lesson in a story, so kids can learn. And even our puppet days, I remember, we'd be behind the curtain doing our puppets and the kids in the front row would be giggling, but then the adults standing in the back would be howling, at our jokes. And we just had so much fun with that. Phil actually wanted to be a filmmaker. I mentioned I wanted to be a doctor, but, we got to be good friends. And, I moved up to Chicago to go to school and ended up getting a job at the same place that he was working at. And so we were in this production world just as this new technology was emerging. Both of us grew up in the church. Both of us recognized the power of storytelling. And we thought, wow, if we could take these values and wrap them up in really fun stories for kids, that would be something that would be really valuable for parents and kids. Because, looking around, around, there was really entertaining stuff on one side for kids, but not necessarily good for them. And on the other side, there was really earnest and wholesome stuff for kids, but it really wasn't that entertaining. And so what if we could combine that? And that's what we were looking at doing. And we didn't really know. We were just writing stuff that we thought was funny, coming from a worldview that we ascribed to. And, we weren't trying to write to an audience. We were just writing stories with comedy that made us laugh. And I think for artists, that's such an important thing to just note, that for something to be truly creative, it has to have a voice behind it. It can't be generic,
right.
Like, okay, we're just going to go through the motions and this is what a story is. But, it has to sound like somebody in particular. And I think that's really important to say, okay, you can't just go through the motions and connect the dots to create a story, make a thing. It has to have that voice. Even as young as we were, we hadn't had any of that sort of training. But looking back on it now, it's like, okay, we were afforded the opportunity to have our artistic voice shine through in our work.
Right. I think the way that you were able to unpack the hero's journey in a way that gave it voice and was really specific and unique to these two characters who kids and parents alike fell in love with. When did you know that you really had hold of something? Because, it's one thing as a creative to begin going down a path and like, oh, we could do this and this would be super cool. And what about if we did this and such? And it's a whole other thing to realize that it's beginning to resonate. You had some seeds of that when you were watching parents responding to puppet shows, but now you're talking about putting something on screen. You're talking about musical scores.
Right.
You're talking about the cost involved in producing illustrative animation. So when did you know, okay, this actually might, pardon the pun, this actually might have legs, even though Bob and Larry don't.
It never will. Sometimes those puns, I know what it's like. They just come to me.
They just come to me.
You just can't help it.
I know.
Well, I remember the first time for me personally, we were working on show one and I was watching Junior's living room render out line by line on our workstation. And computer animation was so new at the time, and it was just so engaging that I'm like, oh my goodness, we're creating stories within this visual world that is just going to be so engaging. It's so engaging to me. So I kind of felt like, okay, we could really have something here. But it was really tough to get it going. We scraped together enough funding to make the first episode, but we didn't have distribution. So we took out ads in Christian parenting magazines, got 500 orders for our very first copy, which we put on VHS and sent it out. Those 500 orders, I think it was $15 an order. So it came out to maybe $7,500, and all in with production costs and everything and marketing, we were up near $100,000. So it didn't even come close to covering that.
Judge it.
But out of that, we did get a distribution deal. One of the orders came from a record label who was starting a kids shingle and loved the show. So we built it and they came in that sense, And so Christmas of 93 was our first show. By 94, we had a distribution deal. But it was slow going, in those early years, but it was all very word of mouth. We were placed in Christian bookstores, and then we started hearing stories about just kind of how the word was spreading. And I think when we heard that there were dorm parties where, college students were having VeggieTales watching parties, that's kind of when I thought, okay, there's something.
Something's happening.
Here. Yeah. But, because we were in our little studio in Chicago putting these out, we didn't have direct contact with our audience, even like you would doing puppetry or live theater. It took a number of years for us to start hearing word back. So it really wasn't until 96 or so that things really started to explode with VeggieTales.
Yeah, you thought we've really started to get something here. What strikes me about the VeggieTales moment and coming into existence and catching speed is my oldest child was born in 90. And I felt like there was this renaissance of animated films that happened at that time. There had been this whole catalog of things that when you and I were kids that had come out. And then there really wasn't, kind of once the Rescuers came out, I don't remember seeing much after the Rescuers, And so it's interesting to me that around the time that VeggieTales started gaining speed, all of a sudden you had, I think Little Mermaid had come out in 88 or 89, and then you had Lion King, and then you had Aladdin, and all these things started happening. And to me, it felt like VeggieTales just got pulled right into that wake in a really beautiful way. And you guys were able to hold your own as this very nascent early experience as you're getting it all together. You guys were able to hold your own. I mean, the VeggieTales movies had just as much place on our VHS shelf, and now those VHSs are in the attic. I probably still have that first VeggieTales movie there.
I'm impressed that you still have those VHS.
I'm just a real sentimental mom about some stuff. But it's interesting to me that for my kids, they were just as happy to reach for that as they were a Disney film. And I, as a mom, was so engaged with the films as well, which brings me to this point. There is this place that you have to catch the attention of the parent if you're going to also catch the attention of the child. And I work with a lot of people. I've worked on different children's books. And this is one of the things that you really have to be aware of as a parent, is to know that you can be sold on something that seems like a children's product.
Right.
And it may not really appeal that much to your kid. They've sold well to you, but your kid is like, yawn. There may be things that your kids love that you aren't that engaged in at all, and you don't understand why they like it. Somehow you guys bridge that gap, because we as a family would watch, you talking about dorm parties where people were watching. I shared with you that we rewatched the Lord of the Rings series, and then we have to watch Lord of the Beans as, the final follow-up to all of watching all that film series. So how did you work, or was it just one of those things that just happened? It was just part of who you guys were, but how did you incorporate all that to where it did become this family experience in a different way?
Well, part of it, I would say, was just it's kind of who we were and what drove us just in our humor to be received by both. But, I think what we really tried to do was just make sure that every show had a core value and a core lesson. And we wanted to make that very clear to a 4-year-old and make sure that however the theme of a story played through, that a 4-year-old could grasp what that was. And they could follow the story, and at the end of the story, be able to tell you what they learned. Being careful to not preach that, but have that be evident in the journey of the hero going through, in the arc of the characters. But for us, if the humor was not inappropriate, it's like we just wanted to laugh, and so, I think back of my childhood and Bugs Bunny and all the early Warner Brothers stuff, and all of the stuff I did not get as a child, watching it as an adult. It's like, oh, that's brilliant, that's so great, and so we didn't want to say, oh, a kid isn't going to get this, so we're gonna leave it out. No, it's like the kid may not get it now, but they'll get it later, and it's not inappropriate, and so hopefully their parents will get it. So that sort of thing with the humor, we just sort of made the humor for all ages, but we wanted to make sure that the language of the lesson was for a 4-year-old. But of course, we're talking about stories from the Bible and values from the Bible. Those are applicable to all ages, and there can be, I think, a lot of emotional, deep truth that comes out of that, even in telling a story simply.
Well, and you didn't shy away from some of the tougher stories in the Bible. You've got one on which is basically the story of King David and him noticing Bathsheba. Now you handle it in a very different way. How are those decisions made? Because, let's face it, a lot of times you get a children's Bible or you get children's Bible curriculum, and it's so it's just so antiseptic. It's been cleaned up in a way that sometimes when we try to bridge that gap for our kids, as they're making that move from those childhood experiences of Bible stories, and then we're trying to say, oh, no, but this is really relevant to life today. And yet we have created, I think unintentionally and sometimes with the best of heart, but we've created a cast of characters who seem very otherworldly, very distant, very clean, very holy. And it can really come as either a shock to the system to realize how real these people are, or to feel like you got sold a bill of goods without being able to really see the entirety of it. So how are those decisions made to incorporate some things that are more, they're just tougher stories to tell?
Well, and some of them were really tough for us. Like, it took us a long time to really, and one of the very last direct-to-video stories that we did was the story of Noah, because childhood nurseries are filled with the ark and the animals and all of that, but in reality, it's everybody dies. It's a story where all but 8 people die. So how do you tell that kind of a story from beginning to end to a child? And so it took a while to be able to figure that out. You mentioned King George and the Ducky, which was sort of a David and Bathsheba type of story, but we sort of made it a bit of a metaphor in terms of he's fallen in love with a ducky on a roof and all that, and we never called it the story of David and Bathsheba, but people knew the story, saw right through that. It's like, oh, I know what you guys are doing. Alongside of that, we wanted to just kind of have it clear that these are an ensemble cast of vegetables that are putting on sort of a Sunday school kids version of this skit of this Bible story. And it was always our intention to say, hey, we're trying to capture the essence and the main value or the main lesson within this story, but make sure you go check this out. Check this out yourself and just get the broader context and learn more about it as you go on. So sort of an entry point into it. that we didn't want to make VeggieTales the end all be all of a child's, biblical education.
The complete exegetical, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But if they could say, oh man, the theme of Joseph, is just so clear by watching Little Joe, this is wonderful. And now you could go in as an older child or an adult to dig into it and see how much more rich that is. But we wanted to have that point. It's like, okay, this is for fun. We're taking the message seriously. This is the Word of God that we're dealing with here. We can have fun with this in a childish way, but these are deep truths and they require more exploration after VeggieTales.
Right. Unpack for me, because, sometimes when we try to make attempts at metaphorical approaches and creativity to Bible truths and Bible characters, and sometimes it'll spark in people this sense of, it's blasphemous, or it's not exactly to the truth, or we shouldn't make light of these things. We shouldn't make cartoons of these things, that kind of a thing.
Yeah.
And yet, God's the one who gives creativity. How do you approach that when it comes to your own creative soul that God's given you, the gifts He's given you, and trying to use them in ways that are for a greater good? But you have sometimes around you critics who don't understand the way in which you're trying to do it. Maybe they're coming from a heart of not wanting a message to get watered down or morphed or whatever. How do you handle that within yourself to know how far to go, maybe how far is too far, and at the same time to live well within what you've been called to do?
Yeah. And I will say writing a story is really hard. Even as difficult as the animation process and time consuming that is, getting the story right is always the most challenging thing. There's nothing more terrifying than that black screen, fade in or, chapter one. And so I feel like, for me, it's like having grown up in the church, recognizing kind of where those boundaries are in my faith tradition to say, okay, I can kind of have fun pushing it up to here, but there remains the sacred that you can't trample on. For instance, we made the decision really early on to never show Jesus as a vegetable. So that to us was a line in the sand. It's like, no, that just won't work. I mean, we're portraying Moses and Paul and, all these other characters in a way like this ensemble cast way, but we're not going to go there. And so recognizing kind of where those boundaries lie, knowing that we're dealing with concepts and values for preschoolers. So we're not going to be getting into a lot of really controversial theological topics or social topics. These are, foundational topics that Christians and really others will all find agreement on. So there was a lot of that going on as well, just to say, okay, we're teaching loving your neighbor and not being selfish and telling the truth and all of these kind of foundational things. And then as a storyteller, just making sure you're staying true to your theme, that your theme is actually coming out of the story and you're not forcing language in there that it's not supported by your story, all those kinds of things. And I don't even know if I'm answering the question, but it's just it's a difficult process to create a story that resonates emotionally, because I do think animation and film in particular is such an emotional experience. And I think you get to the ideas through emotion, so you have to make sure that people are feeling their way through the story, they're identifying with the character, and because of that, those themes and those ideas come out of that. And so I feel like I'm rambling.
No. Animation done well, to me, one of the things that's incredible to me, and I can remember having these moments watching some of the VeggieTales shows. I can remember some of this and some of the Disney and some of the other players out there who also do animation. That moment where you feel like, man, that guy's such a good actor. And then you realize you're looking at a cucumber, and it happens. I mean, because we have to have the suspension of belief in general when we take on creative metaphors and themes and mediums. But with animation, there's even another step that has to happen. And so when you see that somebody's really willing to suspend that place of realism and go with you there with an animated character, that to me is just a whole other level of creativity that is mind blowing to me. But, with any series, I mean, for people who are writing like their detective series or their dragon series or whatever, there comes a moment where it's time to let that cast of players take a rest. And then you begin new endeavors and you embrace new characters. And you've been engaging in some new work that I think is going to be really interesting to hear about. The name in and of itself has me giggling on a number of fronts, but you've been playing around with a project called Dead Sea Squirrels, a play on Dead Sea Scrolls. Right. So when did this new idea come, and how long has it kind of taken you to make some pivots into some new creative places? Because I know in my own work, if I'm heading down a particular stream and I get used to that world that I've built and the rules of that world and the constraints of that world, and then all of a sudden I'm switching over into another project, sometimes those can feel kind of like abrupt changes. So when did you know you were ready to take on some new work, and when did the idea for this new project start to come to life?
The idea for the new project has been with me probably for a dozen years at least. While I was working full-time with VeggieTales, the concept came to me and largely I mentioned we never were going to show Jesus as a vegetable. I wanted to come up with a series that would allow the telling of more New Testament stories. A lot of my things come to me as bad puns, so VeggieTales is a bad pun, Dead Sea Squirrels is a bad pun. So I thought, what would it be like to have, instead of going back into Bible times and retelling stories like that, what would happen if we brought characters forward in time into the modern world? Much like the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in a cave and they contain all this ancient wisdom. What if these two squirrels could be discovered and then tell us about their experience in life in the first century? So that was the kernel of the idea. And I left Big Idea full time in 2016. And largely that was just because the business model of what we were doing was no longer viable. We were a direct to video company and nobody was buying DVDs anymore.
Right.
And so we couldn't fund our projects anymore. And so we had gone through the history of Big Idea. It's a roller coaster of going through a number of sales and purchases. And most recently, before I left, we were owned by DreamWorks. And then when DreamWorks was acquired by Universal, that's when the home video unit closed down. And basically it's like, okay, well, now God's putting me on my next step in life.
Yeah.
And I still am involved with Veggies. I do the voice of Larry and do some writing for other projects that are going on, but it's not full time. And at that point, I then started to develop the Dead Sea Squirrels idea a little bit more. I had the time to do that. And I went to a friend of mine who's my agent, Dan, and I was talking to him about wanting to develop this into an animated series. And his background was in the publishing world. And he said, well, have you ever thought about this as a book series? I hadn't, but I thought that was a good idea. So I went and started doing research and really liked that thought. And so I worked up a kind of the world of what it could look like as a book series. And then he invited me out to lunch. It was just very casual. He said, I'm having my friend Linda and I are going to have lunch. And, she's from Tyndale Publishing. So, would love you to come with us. And so I was like, okay. So I went to lunch and he said, hey, Mike, tell Linda about your idea for Squirrels. And it's like, I didn't know this was going to be a pitch lunch. I'm not prepared. And so, but I shared the idea and she loved it. And so did a deal with Tyndale for 6 books and wrote those starting 2017, 2018. And then those have done well. And I'm currently writing book 10 as part of the second series. So there'll be 12 books in all. So it's been great. And I've been able to develop these stories, but it was originally conceived as animation. And so I always thought, these would be great animated as well. And I've also been looking for a way to make that happen. That's been over the course of the last year. We were talking a little bit before. I'm a professor at Lipscomb University in Nashville, Tennessee, and I work with a guy named Steve Taylor, who is also a music producer, but a filmmaker as well. He founded the film program there. And Steve and I started talking, and then our animation program was founded by Tom Bancroft, who we were talking about those early Disney films. Tom animated Young Simba and Mushu and Mulan. Could we produce an animated series out of the university with the faculty that are here mentoring some of the top students and then working with an outside animation company? So we started to put this whole idea together, and we found enough money for a pilot. And so we're nearly done with the pilot. So we're posting that next month.
Awesome.
And launching a series. So we've got a lot of interest around that and super excited at this point that this will live as an animated series soon. It's been just a fun process of creating another world. And, I have to say that if I would have remained at Big Idea, in 2016, I just wouldn't have had the time and the energy to put into this. So it was one of those things where it's like, okay, Mike, God's saying, okay, now it's something new needs to be born. And, now you have the time to do that.
For you as a creative, just what a cool thing to have the experience of having video first as this expressive experience, and then to be able to write this series. So many writers, that's what we would all love to see, is to see our books, particularly those within the fiction realm, become something that then you can actually see on screen. So for you to get to have both of those experiences going one direction from film into all of the different products that came after for VeggieTales, and then this time around with Dead Sea Squirrels, being able to take the written word and then transpose that into a video format. That's just so incredible. Well, Mike Nawrocki, I can't thank you enough for being on today. I know that we are just going to have a whole bunch of listeners who both themselves may have grown up with VeggieTales and now are introducing their kids to it, and who are going to be so excited to hear what you're up to. And let's hear it one more time. Let's just hear Larry Boy take us out.
Okay, Julie, thanks for having me on. And always remember, God made you special, and he loves you very much. Goodbye.
Bye. That was perfect. You'll find more from this episode on the show notes. Be sure and check them out at allmomdoes.com. And wanted to ask you a big favor. Be sure and go to wherever you are listening to this podcast and give us a 5-star rating and review. It really helps us get the word out about the podcast. Can't wait to see you next time on the All Mom Does podcast.